In this video, we're going to wire up the add command together, and in the next video, you're going to wire up the remove command on your own as a challenge. So let's go ahead and jump in. The first thing I'm going to do is change directories. In the last video, we were using that playground folder. I'll be using cd ... to get out of that directory, then / notes-app to get into the Notes app project folder. From there, I'll use clear to clear the output. And up above, I'm going to close all open editors and switch over to the Notes app directory. Now we are going to use app.js and notes.js in this video. Notes.txt, that was created as an example file. The file that we're going to store our data in, as we learned about in the last video, is going to be a JSON file. So let's take a quick moment to delete that notes.txt file. Now, like we did previously, notes.js is going to define a function that gets called in app.js, so let's start there. Right here, we're going to go ahead and define another function, const. I'm going to call this add note, and this is going to be the function responsible for adding a note. It's going to take in the title for the note as the first argument, and it's going to take in the body of the note as the second argument, and its job is to actually get the note saved to the data store. Now, how are we going to do this? Well, we'll talk about that in a second. The first important thing to discuss is how are we going to export more than one thing from notes.js? And the answer is simple. Instead of setting module.exports equal to a single function, we're going to set it equal to an object, and we'll define multiple properties on there for the multiple functions we end up creating. Let's set up both of those properties, the first being getNotes, whose value is going to come from the getNotes function defined up above. So we have a property of the same name as our function. Then we're going to do the same thing for addNote, setting up an addNote property and getting its value from the addNote variable defined up above. So now, in effect, we are exporting an object with two properties, one for each function, meaning that they're both getting exported and they can both be used by another file like app.js. Now, over in app.js, we do indeed require that file we just edited. No longer does it return a single function, so the name getNotes is misleading. We should rename that to something like Notes Utilities or just Notes. This is now an object with two properties. We have a getNotes property and we have an addNote property, both of which we can now take advantage of in this file. And we're going to start by calling addNote in our handler for the add command down below. Right here, currently, we're just logging the title and the body to the console. We're going to go ahead and instead call our new method. So right here, that's going to be note.addNote. And we're going to pass in the two arguments it expects. We just defined it. The first one is the title. The second one is the body. So the title lives on argv.title, then comma space the second argument, that's the body, which lives on argv.body. Perfect. Now the handler is all done. It's passed the information off to addNote, and it's up to addNote to actually do the job of adding the note to the data store. Now, currently, there is no data file, and we don't have any code to read or write from the file system either, so we're going to have to add all of that. The first thing we have to do is load in the existing notes. We don't want addNote to override any data. We want to load in the existing ones, stored as JSON. We're going to parse them. We're going to add something new onto the array, and then save them back to the file system. Now, we'll be loading in our notes from multiple functions. For example, we'll need to load in our notes when someone wants to remove a note. So I'm going to create a little reusable function that just gets that done. Const load notes equals a new function. It does not take in any arguments, and it's going to return an array of notes. So in the end of the day, the goal is to be able to use it like this. Const notes equals, and then we'll just call load notes and get the notes back. So hopefully we can make this API actually work, and we can. Let's go ahead and move into load notes and get this done. Now we are going to use fs to read from the file, so let's make sure to load that in before we try to use it. Const fs equals. We are going to require the file system module. Now we can actually take advantage of it, and we are going to read from the file. Now we don't have a file yet, and that's okay. So right here, const I'm going to call this something like data buffer equals, I'll be using fs.read file sync to load in a file, and we can pick whatever name we like for this. I'm going to call it notes.json. So this is the file we will be reading and writing to. From here, we can convert that buffer into a string. So const data JSON equals, we'll use data buffer.toString. Then finally, we're going to go ahead and parse it. So right here, I can go ahead and return the following. I am going to return the parsed data by calling json.parse and passing in the data JSON value. Now, this code is going to work really well if there is a file and it contains JSON, but it's actually going to fail if there is no file or the file does not contain JSON. Let's go ahead and prove that by running the program. I'm going to run the program using that app command. So from the terminal, that would be node app.js add. We'll provide a title. I'll just stick with the letter T, and we'll provide a body. I'll just stick with the letter B. And if we run that command, what do we get? We get a really long error message. And if we scroll up, I can see that the English readable version is no such file or directory to open. And then it's talking about our notes.json file, which we're trying to load. So clearly that's a problem. Now we have a couple of options. We could, one, create that file, or two, we could write defensive code that knows how to work even if that file doesn't exist. And that's the approach that we are going to take. To do this, we're going to use JavaScript's try-catch statement. So right here, try with a code block. So we open and close a set of curly braces. Then after the closing braces, we set up our catch block and we define our error, which I'll just call E, and we set up our catch code block. Now, if any of the code inside of try throws an error, that code is immediately going to stop and it's going to run the catch block instead. So that means we can take these 3 lines, cut them out, and move them into try. So if either of these 3 lines throws an error, the code will immediately stop and it'll run catch instead. If they all work, that's great. We will get the parsed data back as expected. Now, what do we want to do if one of these things fails? Well, if there is no file and that throws an error, this code is going to run. So all we're going to do is return an empty array. This is basically what would happen if we had an empty file. So we don't have to worry about overriding data. Because this code is running, we know there is no data, so we'll just start add note off with an empty array. It can then add the first item to that array, and later on, it'll be saved to the file, so a file will actually exist, and it can be loaded the next time around. So let's go ahead and test this out. Right here, console.log printing notes. I'm going to save notes.js. I'm going to rerun the exact same command I ran before by using the up arrow key and enter. And this time around, what do I get? I get my empty array showing up, which is great. Now that we are at least getting an empty array, we can start the process of adding our new note on to the list. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to use the push method on arrays. So right here, notes dot push. And we are going to push on what? I'm going to push on an object. So we'll be representing each note as an object with title and body properties. So right here, I'll set the title property equal to whatever value is stored on that title argument, and I'll do the same thing with body down below, setting up a body property whose value comes from the body argument up above, defined on line 7. So now we've loaded in the data. We've added something to the array. The next thing we're going to go ahead and do is save that data. Now, once again, we'll be saving data from multiple places in our application as well. So we're going to create a little reusable function for that. Down below, right before load notes, though the order is not important, we're going to create a new constant, and I'll call this one something like save notes. Now, save notes is going to be a very simple function, but it is indeed going to take an argument. It's going to take in the array. So remember, when we want to save data, we take the object or an array, we use JSON stringify, and then we write it to the file system. That's exactly what we're going to do with whatever data is passed in. So right here, let's use save notes up above. I'm going to call save notes. I'm going to pass in the notes array, which has been changed since it was originally loaded in. So we're going to end up saving that new note. And then all we're going to do is stringify the data and save it to the file system. Right here, I'll create a constant for that stringified JSON. I could call it something like data JSON. That would work just fine. And we'll use the JSON.stringify method, which we've used plenty of times before. And we're going to pass in notes. Now we have our JSON data and we need to write it to the same file we were loading from. So we have a notes.json file. Well, we don't have it yet, but we'll have it shortly. fs.write file sync, writing to notes.json. And what are we writing? We are writing whatever is stored in that data JSON variable above. And there we go. We load in the notes, we change them, and we save them. This is essentially what you did for your challenge in the last video, with just a little more complexity, adding a little error handling to make sure that things always work smoothly. Let's go ahead and test this out. Now the program should indeed create that file. I'm going to rerun the same command we were using before. And what do I get? I get no output. That's okay. There is no console.log statement running, but I do have my notes.json file. And if I crack that open, it looks like an array with a single object inside. That object has a title property with the value of T and a body property with the value of B, both coming from the options we provided to the command line down below. And this is a fantastic step towards creating the notes application. And now let's go ahead and add one more note right here. I am going to load in the previous command and just use the arrow keys to change the data. So I'll remove the T for title and I'll use something like list as the title. Then for body, I'm just going to list out some stuff maybe that I need to buy. It's getting cold out, so let's go ahead and put in sweater, and I'll also put in some new pants. Not plants. Perfect. Now, if we run this, hopefully we don't override the existing data, but we just append to it. I'm going to run the script. And what happens? Well, hopefully in just a second, we see our refreshed data, and there it is. We have our existing note from earlier, and we have our brand new note with the correct title and body values. So this proves that both of the cases for load notes are working. The first time around, when there was no file, this did indeed throw an error, so we started off with an empty array, giving us a bare bones way to actually create that file. The next time we ran it, this didn't throw an error. It correctly parsed the existing data. It then added on to that existing data and saved it. And in the end of the day, we are seeing the correct results over here. Now let's wrap up this video by adding one more small feature to our function. We're going to make it so that add note checks if that title is already in use. So if I'm trying to add a note with a title and that title's already taken, the application won't let you add it again. So we're going to prevent duplicate notes from being added. Let's go ahead and knock this out. First up, I am going to clear the output down below. Then we're going to make some changes to the add note function. The first thing we need to do is look through the notes array and see if any of those notes have this title. And to do that, we're going to use the array filter method. And the reason I'm doing this now is because in the next video, you're going to have to use the array filter method for your challenge as well. Now let's go ahead and actually knock this out right here. That's going to be const. We are going to create a new array called duplicate notes. In here, we'll store all of the duplicate notes we find. If we find none, great. We'll go ahead and run this code. If we find some, that's obviously a problem and we won't add the new one because it would be a duplicate. Let's go ahead and use the method. That's an array method. We'll call it on the notes array. It is filter. This is going to return a subset of the notes array. So if there's 40 items in here, duplicate notes will be either 40 items or less, depending on how many match our criteria. And we define that criteria by setting up a function. And this function gets called one time for each note. So in our current case, it would get called 2 times, once with this object, then once with this object, and we access the object via that first argument. Right here, we can call this whatever we like. I have an array of notes. We have individual items over here, so I'll call it singular note. Now the goal is to return either true or false. If we return true, filter is going to keep that individual note in the new array, calling it a duplicate. If we return false, filter is not going to keep that in the array, saying it's not a duplicate. Now, we don't want to type out the Booleans explicitly. Instead, we're going to use a little conditional logic. We're going to use the equality operator to check if note.title equals the title argument from up above. So this function is going to run twice. The first time, it's going to see if our title equals this. If it does, it's going to return true, meaning we have a duplicate. If it doesn't, it's going to return false, leaving the duplicate notes array empty. It's then going to call this function again with the second object. We're going to compare that title and go through the same process. So this array is going to have 0 items if no duplicates were found. And now we can use that to conditionally run some code down below. If a condition and a code block to run. The condition, we're going to look at the duplicate notes array. If its length is 0, we know we didn't find any duplicates, which means that we can safely add this note. So down below, I can take these two statements, I can cut them out, and I can paste them inside of the code block. And we can even print a little message, console.log, something like new note added. Perfect. Now we could also add on an else clause to this if statement, and in here, we could run some code if duplicate notes.length is not equal to 0, in which case we have found a duplicate, console.log. I can say something along the lines of note title taken. Perfect. Now that we have this in place, let's go ahead and see it work in action. I'm going to try to add a duplicate, make sure that fails, then I'll try to add a new one and make sure that works. From the terminal, let's go ahead and cycle through our previous commands, looking for one of the ones we've already executed. Right here, this is the command where we added the list note. Now that already exists in the data. That should be caught as a duplicate. Let's run the program and see what happens. Right here, note title taken, which is great. You'll notice that no new note was added because the title was already in use. So the duplicate notes array had a single item. The first time it ran our callback, it ran it with the note object being this one right here. Now the title T did not match up with the one provided, which was list, so that returned false and nothing was in the duplicates array. The next time it ran, it used this object, seeing if this one was in the array already, and it was. It compared note.title, which is this value, with the value provided, and those are identical, which means that this returned true, which means that item was kept in the duplicate notes array, bringing the length to 1. So this condition did not pass. This code was the code that ran. Now let's load in that same command and change the title. I'll create a new list called list2. I'll run the command, and now we can see new note added, and over in the JSON, we have our third note added onto the list. So now that we have this in place, we have one of our commands knocked out. In the next video, it's going to be up to you to wire up the remove functionality. I'm excited to get to that, so let's go ahead and jump right in to the next one.